The story and impact of Space Battleship Yamato is one of the most inspiring and important events in the history of anime. When it first appeared in 1974, it shook the foundation of what TV manga could do. It would be the strong, innovative, and emotional writing of Yamato that would partly aid the medium towards getting the name anime itself. It's cited as an inspiration for many valuable works such as Evangelion, Super Dimension Fortress Macross, and Mobile Suit Gundam, as well as Legend of the Galactic Heroes. Now that I think about it, Hideaki Anno, the creator of Evangelion, did quite a harvest on his influences. If you look at early mecha, there was a series with a character named Rei Asuka. For example, another example, the song original Yamato theme was slightly recycled and used in Evangelion as the song background music too. There were already several science fiction works before Yamato. Still, the fleet battles, dramatic narration, and the strong structure of its story was bold and fresh at the time. It was a huge risk. Perhaps the viewers were not ready for an anime like this, as it did not do so well at the start. Once the movies released, series creator Leiji Matsumoto, who would go on to do many famous works such as Galaxy Express 39 and Space Pirate Captain Harlock, noticed a large amount of fan mail coming from fans. This was especially among the women, to his surprise. Director Noboru Ishiguro, who would go on to direct works such as Macross and Legend of the Galactic Heroes, explained that the sudden influx of fans resulted in many traveling, some by plane, to their studio during production. As a result, the staff would hand out animation cells and background pictures as a thank you to the fans. The impact of Space Battle Yamato was so great that it inspired the creation of the game Space Invaders. The Yamato's wave motion gun was also the inspiration for the Hadouken in Street Fighter. Not only that, it is rumored that it had an influence in the first Star Wars films, in the first Star Wars film that came out a few years later. George Lucas won't admit it despite that the similarities are there. Just one example is the Analyzer. It's a comedic robot that is rumored to have possibly been the inspiration for R2-D2. This has been a topic of debate for decades that has reached no conclusion, as many viewers are constantly agreeing and disagreeing. Truly, if Yamato never existed, the many great works I mentioned earlier today may never have existed as well, or been very different without it perhaps. Being a work of Matsumoto, the master of Melancholy, you can expect an emotional and dramatic space voyage as the Yamato ventures through space. The Gamulas, led by Albert Dessler, is facing a dilemma. The life of their planet is running out. As a result, they decide to go out on a mission to take over the planet Earth. To destroy the humans, they sent out a barrage of meteor strikes that destroyed so much of human civilization that humanity had to go underground. Schools are being used as hospitals previously, and many of the women had to become nurses out of necessity. In addition to that, the Gamulas flooded the Earth with radiation that threatens to seep into the Earth and wipe out the last of humanity. In an attempt to save the human race, humanity has deployed an old World War II ship modified now as the Space Battleship Yamato to travel out towards Iskandia to acquire a machine that is capable of destroying the radiation poisoning that is slowly killing the planet and themselves. The crew only has a year to make the round trip and faces many obstacles along the way through space anomalies and Gallimus fleet battles. The voice acting is immaculate. Among the main characters, Kodai is voiced by Kei Tomoyama, who would go on to voice Yang Wenli 14 years later in The Legend of the Galactic Heroes. Shima is voiced by Shuusei Nakamura, most famous for being the voice of Toro Rikishi and Ashura no Jo. The music, I would say, is iconic. There are lots of dramatic and amazing songs that help uplift the fleet battles and tragic moments. The funky drum work in some of the songs is impressive and amusing to see mixed with the scenes. The art for being a work from 1974 is impressive, even by today's standards. The beautiful hand-drawn animation can fluidly and naturally present the brutality of the fleet battles. There is one episode that took the staff nearly 2 months to animate because of that. The character designs are solid, and there were many times interesting effects are used to portray the murkiness of space and the emergence of the Yamato from smoke. As the crew continues their voyage, the stakes run high as their schedule starts falling behind. They have estimated 1 year's time before the radiation destroys the humans back on Earth. At the end of each episode, you can expect to hear the narrator sounding desperate as he counts down the days until humanity's doom and as he hurries for the Yamato to finish its round trip. At this point, I will start using spoilers for the analysis. I would highly recommend watching this historical document of an anime before continuing, unless you don't mind spoilers. In my opinion, though Kodai is the main character, my favorite is Captain Juzu Okita. He is the first captain of this new version of Yamato. His leadership is bold and provocative. His years of experience leads to unorthodox tactics to fight against the Gamulus or to get out of deadly situations. He knows full and well how to lead his team in a serious manner. He may sound cold, but he loves his crew, the Earth, and the rest of humanity. The tragedy of Okita is that he's suffering from radiation poisoning. As the Yamato went on, he often collapsed. The doctor, who is usually seen drunk drinking sake, tells him that he needs to get an operation to stay alive. In Okita's point of view, he is determined to follow along with his duty to lead the crew. However, even I would say that if he doesn't get the operation, it will get in the way of his focus during crucial moments. And this will be the case as he was constantly passing out while on duty. Eventually, he decides to get the risky operation and is left mostly bedridden. A wise man, he spoke some words that really inspired me. There was a time where the crew of the Yamato had doubts about their journey. Hope felt as it was lost, and yet Okita would confront them and state, "Why don't we believe in ourselves? Nothing is sure in life. One step ahead is darkness in our lives. But if you're overly afraid, you won't accomplish anything. Overcoming our fears and believing in our future is an important battle in our minds." Always calm, cool, and collected, he always kept his composure even during the most dire situations. Even after being defeated by some of the Gallimists, he respected their strategy in defeating him. Oftentimes his reactions would be quiet, as he sometimes looked down with his hat covering his eyes, or looked straight ahead with an unshakable determination. Despite there being no dialogue, his reactions feel like they speak louder than words at times. Since the beginning, he felt for the loss of Kodai's brother, who supposedly died in the beginning of the series fighting the Gamulus. Shima would express regret towards Kodai as an engineer that Kodai's brother had entered this mission on a ship that Shima knew was too damaged for the mission itself. Considering all this, Okita developed a bit of a soft spot for Kodai. As his time grew near, Okita would summon Kodai and make him the new captain of the Yamato, determining with the will to live. As the Yamato makes its trip back to Earth, Okita himself had kept himself alive out of a solid resolve that he must see the Earth again before perishing from the radiation. His sheer will to survive kept him alive a little bit longer. It would be around this time that he began thinking about the concept of death. He was under the assumption that the soul leaves the body when someone dies, and looked on out into space while bedridden, wondering where his soul would go after he dies. The most crushing moment in Space Battleship Yamato is his death in the last episode. I was in tears constantly as the writing pushed the blade deeper and deeper into my heart. There were more tragic events that were already giving me heavy emotions in that episode already. As obvious as the obvious demands for the sake of the plot, the Yamato does make the round trip, which I'll look into later in this video. Okita thanks the doctor for his treatment and asks to be left alone. As the emotionally tragic music plays in the background, Okita takes out a picture of his family and caresses it with his hands. His hand then begins to shake up as he tears up. He looks up at the earth and speaks weakly with his dying breath. "Earth, everything about it is precious." He passes on, leaving behind part of the environmental message that the series tries to make about the planet we live in. As he met his end, there is a miracle that happens here that I will explain concerning him and Yuki when I get to her. It's only a theory, but fairly interesting. Kodai is another protagonist and the successor of as captain of the Yamato after Okita personally handpicks him. He suffers from the trauma he faced as a child from the attacks of the Gallimus. His parents were obliterated in a meteor attack. Kodai finds only scraps of their clothes. Later on, he had to go through the supposed death of his brother at the hands of the enemy. Though he grew up as a pacifist, he decided to volunteer for the army, partly due to his brother's wishes for him to do so. It is this trauma that leads to that intense moment where the Yamato crew managed to capture a low-ranking soldier from the Gallimus. At that point, humans did not know what they looked like. Once the doctor reveals the blue man's face, Kodai becomes infuriated. How could a race of aliens so cruel and brutal look like a human being? He cannot accept this and tries to stab the alien with a tool. The crew members stop him as Kodai begins to gather his cool. The captured enemy soldier then tries to take his own life at that point and gets immediately and ironically saved by Kodai right after. To show that the Yamato crew are not the type to torture, they feed the soldier and eventually let him fly back to Gallimimus after failing to get intel out of him. I don't think they ever show that Gallimimus soldier again. I was kind of hoping they would. Throughout the series, there is the obvious romance that builds up between Kodai and Yuki. Yuki already had a crush on Kodai and would tease the oblivious soldier about it constantly. She is a chief member of the crew and is often seen handing drinks out to them, performing her tasks during missions, or finding herself victimized by the Analyzer. She is the main woman protagonist, and for an anime as far back as 1974, has a beautiful character design. Her personality can be very playful, yet behind the scenes she is depressed about being separated from her family. There are a few points where the crew are allowed to communicate with Earth during their trip. The entire crew are allowed 5 minutes to talk to family, and you can see the desperation of the people on Earth during this time, as well as the emotional breakdown of the crew, who miss family and home. When Yuki calls her parents, she sees that her mother has become obsessed with her getting married and having lots of kids for the sake of the continuation of humanity. This leads to poor communication as their time run out talking about trivial things. She gets involved in an odd love triangle between her, Kodai, and the Analyzer. The Analyzer is a hilarious robot aboard the Yamato that performs data collecting tasks, among other things. He believes he is a human despite being man-made and not God-made, and is completely in love with Yuki. Outrageously, he often flirts with Yuki or tries to undress her during inappropriate times. Yuki eventually goes to complain about the Analyzer's predatory ways to Captain Okita, though nothing could be done to reprogram him. Episode 16 would be the episode where she and the Analyzer would come to a resolve. Of course, Yuki tells the robot that she could never be with him because of what he is. The Analyzer disagrees and says that he feels he is human enough to love her. They would eventually get captured while scouting in an unknown land by an alien race because Yuki, for whatever reason, wanted to climb into a strange hole that led to her nest, to their nest. As Yuki talked about the fear of her own death, she accidentally insulted the Analyzer by saying that if he died, he'd just become a pile of scrap metal. The Analyzer argues frustratingly, so that his life is not worth any less to that of a human just because he is a robot. After making up, he decides to do all he can here to protect her, and even Yuki at some point acknowledges that he has a human heart despite being nuts and bolts and hugs him. One part of the emotional side of Space Battleship Yamato is that when the characters hug or caress each other, there is a lot of emphasis on this that shows how precious they all mean to each other. Eventually, they are taken out for execution by the insect race. The Gallimimus, which were controlling these huge insects with fear, appear by sending in a ship, but their crew gets killed. A part of the insects were rebelling and stated that the queen is using them for their blood to give to the Gallimimus. This is true. If any were to rebel, they get crushed and processed into goo. As the civil war goes on, the Yamato crew would come to save her. Though the Analyzer felt closer to Yuki than ever before as they were embraced during the war and rescue mission, she would run from him and go to Kodai, hugging him instead. The Analyzer felt depressed and decided in that moment that maybe he really is just a robot after all. At the end, Yuki confronts him and reminds the robot that they could never work out. The Analyzer responds that he'll always love her. As he rolls away, he asks her, "There's nothing wrong with loving someone, right?" Creepy behavior aside, the Analyst is the funniest character in the series and the best source of comedy in general, but how outrageous he is. He can often be found getting drunk with the doctor by pouring sake over his metallic head. Something I started thinking about halfway into the series is the mental effect of being stuck out in space for hundreds of days. The series does address this later as some of the crew begin to lose their minds from being stuck out in space, away from their families for too long. One crew member named Aihara would take this to an extreme. Though a gameless plot, Aihara was manipulated into missing his family so much that he loses his composure in front of the crew and jumps out of the ship in a suit into space. Eventually, he realizes the wrong in his ways and luckily gets rescued, as he would have died out in space. What is also interesting about this is that the Yamato has an image therapy room. Those who get anxiety are placed there and are given illusions to make them feel as if they are at home or somewhere out in nature or in the wild. In Aihara's case, he recognized this as fake. As a result, it didn't help him and eventually led to where I said he desperately tried to swim back home from space, which was impossible. It is around this time that Kodai himself starts to lose it somewhat. He and Shima, who helps with navigation, often get into arguments and fights here. During one emergency situation, Kodai demands that he follow him. Kodai then expresses his desire to be him, while Shima expresses his desire to toss Kodai out into space. It's amusing to watch until Yuki stops them. Still, they become comrades until the end of the series. Shima himself lost his sister in an accident from a ride at an amusement park, and he himself ends up with 4 cybernetic limbs as a result. He nearly dies during the end, but shows the necessity of sacrifice after he blows up a Gamelist ship by detaching his limbs that had bombs installed in them. Next, I want to talk about the Galamus. They are the main antagonists of the series and are led by Dessler. Dessler is a smug and ruthless ruler that doesn't hesitate to kill his own men, even high-ranking ones, for just slightly annoying him or to just make a point. His goal is to take over the planet, seeing as though their own homeland is collapsing and dying. He becomes interested in the Yamato and decides to destroy it. Time and time again, the Yamato manages to overcome his admirals and dirty tactics. Still, for Dessler, he finds amusement and excitement over this. Oftentimes, he'll laugh with fascination at how strong the Yamato and how intelligent its crew is. It almost feels as if the Yamato itself is what gives him a reason to live or feel excitement in life. Regardless, he tries relentlessly to try and destroy it. Dessler ends up ordering Admiral Domo to the task. Domo ends up replacing Gale, which outraged Gale. Gale was proud of his position and could not stand Domo to the point that he would start sabotaging Domo when trying to destroy the Yamato. There was a point where Domo had assured victory. On the other hand, Gale went to Dessler and told him that Domo was trying to sacrifice one of their bases to destroy the Yamato. Domo was, however, and had to let the Yamato survive the one time he could have destroyed it, since Gale was jealous and spiteful of him. At the same time, Domo often had fun teasing and making fun of Gale, such as when he went into Gale's residence and tossed around his fine china, telling Gale he has bad taste. Even when Gale tried to light Domo's cigarettes with his faulty lighter, Domo used the opportunity to compare Gale's lighter to how incompetent Gale is. As a result, Gale would often show frustration and throw drunk temper tantrums at his residence. Near the end of the series, Domo loses his fleet and decides to self-destruct their ship on the Yamato as a last-ditch effort. As much as they were enemies, both Admiral Domer and Captain Okita recognized and respected the great level of skill they both have for combat. Domo would perish in the self-detonation along with a panicked Gale. Regardless, the Yamato survived. Truly, they are both fighting for the same reasons. The Galamus is just trying to survive by fighting for a new home planet for their people, while the Yamato crew are fighting them to save their own kind and planet. At some point, the vice president of the Galamus pleads with Dessler to try to coexist with the humans, but Dessler disagrees and shoots him to death. An interesting small detail about Admiral Domo is that he decides to keep a rare bird he found at some point. It reminds me of the bird Captain Harlock has, which ends up being paid homage to in Cowboy Bebop as Vicious's bird. In approaching the end of the series, it is revealed that Kodai's brother was still alive the entire time. He had been saved by Starsha, the queen of Iskandar, that the Yamato were traveling to meet for the purification device. Kodai and the crew felt relieved to see him still alive, but Starsha had fallen in love with him. She tells the brother this and runs away right before the Yamato took off. Kodai's brother, though finally reunited with his own brother, apologizes to him and runs back to stay with Starsha in Iskandar. Kodai was fortunately accepting of this, and told Yuki that that his brother and Starsha have become the Adam and Eve of Iskandar. He is right in that the two would go on to rebuild civilization, as it seemed. Before going back home, some of the crew lost face in the last part of the mission to make the delayed trip back to Earth with the Purifier. It was led by a crew member named Yabu, who kidnapped Yuki during that episode. They went to go take over an ice castle, but fell to an environmental disaster. Their goal was to repopulate the humanity there and take over the planet, as they saw the Earth as a lost cause. Yuki was saved, at least. In the final episode, the Yamato makes it back, but not before Dessler reveals that he survived their last battle, and makes a last-ditch effort to destroy them with a large drill. At first, the Galamus board onto the Yamato and inject radioactive gas into it to kill many of the members or crew members. Yuki would activate the purification device to counter, but seemingly perish from the gas during her attempt. The device activates, and the Galamis flee. The Esper then has the Yamato impaled by a giant drill. The Yamato is able to hijack the drill bomb, with the help of the analyzer, and sent it back to him, blowing him up. Still, you can see the Esper vanish before the explosion, revealing that he is still probably alive. Kodai, in complete disbelief that Yuki has died, goes to see her body and decides to carry her to the control room so that she may see their arrival to Earth despite being dead. He makes a love confession that he loved her since the beginning. He was waiting until the mission was over to confess, but cries with her in his arms, seeing as though it's impossible now. As the Yamato sees Earth in his vision, this is where the miracle theory comes into play. Immediately after Okita dies, Yuki comes back to life. Perhaps it's about when they were talking about where souls go after they die. Maybe Okita's soul revived Yuki. Still, that's just a guess, just a theory. The Yamato makes it back home within the long time limit, and the Earth appears to be saved. The story concludes, leaving the viewers with heavy hearts for the price it took for victory. If I also point out the flaws in this, there are a few. Sometimes the filter used to portray the murkiness of space stays in place inside the Yamato. Maybe it was done on purpose, I'm not too sure. Yuki reviving may not make much sense to some viewers because it isn't outright explained. Something that kind of bothered me is that the Yamato takes much more damage or punishment than it should. It gets constantly blown up, rammed into, melted, and severely damaged. Regardless, the crew always seems to have the resources to repair whatever happens to it. It felt just a bit too convenient at times. Despite this, Space Battleship Yamato has secured itself in my favorites list as an important part of anime history and as an essential viewing. The spirit of Yamato would live on through Macross, Orgus, Legend of Galactic Heroes, Titania, and in all the other space operas, including Mobile Suit Gundam Wing, that carried the torch. Thank you for listening.